Hey everybody, this is the July 11th DeSci Labs community call. Today we're going to be talking about some of the problems, issues, and pitfalls in the larger DeSci space that we need to be aware of moving forward, as there are quite a few of them all over. Definitely not a topic that gets addressed often, but it's something that needs to be looked at and talked about more because oftentimes it gets ignored. So excited to have that conversation. In the meantime, just a couple regular cleaning updates. Thank you to all of our alpha testers. We've gotten some amazing feedback from each and every single one of them and should be starting to host journal clubs soon, where an alpha tester uses DeSci nodes to make a node about something that they personally are passionate about, the research that they perform or a paper that they've read recently. I've seen a couple of these that are being built and I'm very excited to see what comes out of it. So thank you to all of our alpha testers. Uh, the weekly updates this past week came from Jose, Semi Crypto. So anyone who wants to go look at that can easily navigate to that channel and take a look. So a lot of great information and insights that were put on there. Uh, then I think beyond that, we're still working on making the bounty board, and we'll be talking about that more in the coming future. So to anyone who wants to contribute, that should be an immediate way to come in and do so. Then we also had one core contributor post the idea of coffee chats and helping facilitate one-on-ones for different community members to just know the other folks, get to know the other folks in the community. Really excited for that one to take off because there's some incredible people in this Discord, and it's always exciting to meet different folks. Um, with that being said, does anyone else have anything that they want to add before we jump into the meat of the call? Actually, I forgot one thing. Our very own Philip Kohlinger is going to be talking about impact certificates at ETHCC in Paris. It's going to be fantastic. So for any of you who want to tune in, we will be posting more information around that in the near future. And with that being said, seems like no one has any additional thoughts or anything else that they want to bring up. So let's go ahead and get started with the call. The topic today is some of the issues and potential pitfalls in the larger DeSci ecosystem. So does anyone have anything that they want to get us kicked off with?
Yeah, happy to start the conversation and talking a little bit about that. So, I mean, I have about 7 points of things that I'd like to bring up that are perhaps interesting hooks for broader conversations with all of you. So I can start on that. So. One of the things I've noticed a lot in Web3 companies and in general DAOs or other types of entities is an over obsession with tokens and tokenomic, right? So this comes very regularly. You see people discussing, implementations of tokenomic models, um, whereas in my opinion, it should clearly be the other way around. The value proposition comes from the platform itself and the products themselves. And that needs to be built first. Now, whether or not a certain types of products need a token or not, this is a very product specific question. And these types of answers usually would follow from having experience with the product. So that's one of the pitfalls I see, and in DeSci it's even exacerbated because I strongly believe that scientists have very well attuned bullshit detectors, and with the amount of scams and rug pulls and all of the type of bad behavior that people have observed in the space, especially during the bull market, I think there's a almost like a visceral response that might flare up as a towards these types of proposition. So I think that's and for very good reasons. So I think any of those systems should be very, very well reasoned and follow from a product development, not essentially build a product to fit a particular type of tokenization scheme. And this also goes back to then another point, which is security laws, right? So this is so DeSci is it's about science, it's about scientists, about people that have jobs with the government, people that operate with established, reputable institutions very often. Not all of them, of course. You also have independent scientists, but for most people, that is so. And it's important not to run afoul of security laws. It's important not to run afoul of the types of legal problems and uncertainty that could happen. So, for example, we're quite intent in making this DAO stack, these ARCs, autonomous research community, represented with a Swiss association. And this is simply for because you need a legal entity in order to have protection from problems of shared unlimited liabilities, right? So there's all sorts of things I think here we need to be particularly mindful of, given the audience, given the need to first put products out there that add value to the scientific workflow and that add value beyond making it an expose for a tech stack. So there's a very funny meme that I liked very much that I saw on Twitter. It was essentially the front end of Netflix, right? The landing page of Netflix. And it was written Netflix powered by AWC, right? And that's something you see a lot with a lot of these Web3 companies or Web3 development efforts. It's like you put the tech before the value. And I think that's also kind of a sign of immaturity in the industry in general. And so the real value should manifest itself from the user, from functionalities and benefits that could not be had before without having to put, let's say, an expose on the technology at the very forefront of the UI. Yeah, I mean, I have many other points to talk about, going from questions of UX, Web3 UX, which is and also quite a fundamental point, and going to stakeholder representation. But first, before I continue too far on this discussion, I'm happy to have some members here and people contribute and bounce off on some of those things.
I just want to say, sorry, go for it, John.
Did we both just count to 5?
Yes, we did.
I think you're hitting on a lot of really good points there. The tokenization, like the financialization of the space, has been around for every cycle, and it just seems to get worse and worse. And now that DAOs are so easy to set up, it's kind of scary because people are like, yeah, I want to have a governance stake in something that's really cool, like a Web3 project. But you don't really, people aren't really aware of the implications of what they're doing, or maybe they're just not thinking about it. But DAOs are at risk of being securities. There's a lot of legal stuff that can happen to a DAO. Like if a DAO gets hacked, the DAO creators might be liable for that because they're not technically LLCs. And it's always painful to watch new people come into the space, and then with all this hope and like bright-eyed, bushy-tail sort of energy, and then see something happen like a bear market that absolutely destroys them, all because the focus of some of these products is focused on building tokens before the tech, like you're saying. This is why I like what you guys are doing so much, because the tech is clearly first, and it's super cool tech. The security stuff too, just really quickly, that's going to pick up a lot. I think, did Solana just get a class action lawsuit because they were someone who invested early said they were a security? Like that's not even the SEC coming after them. I think that's an early investor. This is it's going to get pretty intense.
Classic move by early investors. Disgruntled early investors love to denounce projects to the SEC. That's So yeah, there's all sorts of things in this space, happening on the legal side, and I think that's why, especially being a science-focused project, a public good-focused project, we want to basically do things in a way that has compatibility with the existing legal world and doesn't run afoul of it. So that's very important for us.
Two things to kind of play off of there, John and Chris, and some of the points that you've made. I see tokenization as a product as kind of almost a symptom of a larger issue, which is hyper financialization in crypto. Everything needs to be immediately financialized. Everything needs to be something that can be profited off of. But I see that not necessarily gelling with science. As not everything needs to end in profit for industry. Not everything needs to end in some kind of intellectual property. A lot of times it just doesn't necessarily fit. So I think to a certain extent, we're going to have to think about the existing Web3 business models that are there and make sure that we're adapting that for science itself because it is distinctly different.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the problem of hyper financialization. And I think that's also why, we've been thinking for quite a long time, problems of identities and challenges around identity to establish participant reputation, to use things like non-transferable tokens to track reputations. Because there's clearly a rampant problem in that space around the hyper financialization of everything, including governance, which, when you think about it, is a very curious thing to do and a very flawed thing to do in terms of social choice theory. So by using essentially tokens that have a certain financial value as a voting mechanism, while these tokens are transferable, this introduces all sorts of possible governance attacks where the majority token holder could elect itself to basically drain the treasury and transfer the treasury to itself. And regardless of the types of security mechanisms you might implement for that, you can, for example, you've had this meme around with V tokens, right? You can always have wrapper functions that allow you to bypass these types of mechanisms. So this is a real issue, and to my knowledge, there's been only two rational responses to this so far. Well, I would say three rational responses. One of them has been this idea of delegated governance, which you find in MakerDAO, which you find in other types of protocols like the Graph, where they have essentially handpicked people who are considered to be trustworthy, have a certain reputation, have disclosed their conflicts of interest, have put forth a platform summarizing their values. And these people are essentially a guardrail against the type of governance attack that could happen. I mean, it's not foolproof, but it is a guardrail mechanism. This is one mechanism. Another one that has been also implemented is multi-chambered governance. So you have that, for example, Optimism is experimenting with this, such that you have a two-chamber system, one in which essentially you have pro rata power according to the amount of tokens you own, and the other one in which you have a different system that is based on having proof of personhood, that is based on having essentially people that have that are counterbalancing the governance interests of the token holders, right? And that's very important because this leads us to another point, which has been, in my opinion, very much has not been represented to the degree it should. It's the problem of stakeholder representation, right? The question is, who should your stakeholders be? And I think, for example, take a platform like Optimism, take an L2, take all these types of technologies. You could say, well, my stakeholders are clients that pay for my gas fees or these kinds of things. But you could also say, wait. developers perhaps should also be my stakeholders, right? Because you need to do things so that developers adopt these products so that they're easy to use, so that they're convenient to use. So it's similar to the problems of shareholders versus stakeholders that we have in traditional companies. There's a case to be made that we should have a broader representation of interest at the table when it comes to the ultimate executive power in a company. In the case of science, and this is an interesting case, think of a company like Elsevier, which essentially has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to maximize shareholder value. That's the discounted future cash flow that the company will generate, right? It has no fiduciary duty whatsoever to scientists or to science in general, or to essentially entities that operate to create, robust knowledge and reproducible knowledge. So the fact that it is disconnected entirely from a broader stakeholder representation creates the types of incentives which lead to can lead to problems down the road. Typically, why would they invest in creating more reproducible scientific record if there's, first of all, no demand from the payers, which generate revenue for the company, which then generate shareholder dividends, right? So that's a problem. That's a fundamental issue with stakeholder representations, and perhaps one of the reasons that scientific publishing in general, especially for-profit scientific publishing, but also non-profit scientific publishing, has become so alienated from the actual needs and ideals of reproducibility, replicability, creating more robust science.
Yeah, I think that the danger there, to summarize it, is that we might fall into the same trap that the current system is in. We might end up building the same system accidentally, whereas the stakeholders are the ones with money, and instead of, because this technology actually lets us increase the accessibility of becoming a stakeholder to basically anyone we want when we build these systems, which is not something we can do in the contemporary system. So that's great, like the ability to do that. But the danger is we end up accidentally building a financialized system of science again.
I mean, and this is what you see with Web3 protocols, where essentially, Alameda or, another big VC firm, like essentially just votes itself into the
Yeah.
governance process, right? And they have like this problem of having large stake ownership in a multitude of decentralized protocol, which then leads to yet another issue, which is the problem of essentially having different, the same shareholders owning different competitors, stakes in different competitors, like you have now today with BlackRock's and other big pension funds, that own all the big banks in Wall Street to like a 5 to 10% ownership stake. So this leads to these problems. And I think that's why one of our priorities, one of the things we're working on right now is creating a governance charter for the DeSci Foundation. And that governance charter aims precisely at outlaying a vision of how we can essentially enfranchise different stakeholders into the system that would not essentially, without having the majority of stakeholder controlled by the people, which essentially the funders, which have the financial firepower, right? So the idea is, how can we create a system that has a balance of power based on stakeholder representation? And you would think that such a system should have representation not only from science funders, which are of course very important, but should also have representation from meta scientists, people that actually care, for the quality of science that's produced. And there's other types of stakeholders as well that they are for which there are good arguments that they should be represented at the system. So that's something we're working on, a vision for how the future of the DeSci Foundation governance could work with. And the goal of that is to also lay the foundations for avoiding a repeat of the mistakes of the past.
That's interesting. I had a question in there. I lost it.
This is a good time to open it up for anyone else who might have a question or a thought.
I'll pop in really quickly. One question I had, this is a really helpful discussion. I'm really enjoying it. But also the one that I had that I've noticed with, and I think everybody has with open science, open source, is this repetition of as Jay Ringo, I guess, was discussing of the power systems just because of who enters the space. And this is something that was talked about a little bit in terms of just like, all right, who's going to actually enter this space? And right now we have a lot of like physical world limitations that lead to there being a large bias in who's entered into the scientific space in general. So is there a way that, or a mechanism that people are thinking about that enfranchises people who are outside of the scientific ecosystem to start having a stake? And is this just education, or is this like, is there another accessibility mechanism?
So I think it depends where the say is. If it's, for example, anyone can start an autonomous research community and start curating research objects. So now you can imagine, what do you do in the case where whatever autonomous research community has been spawned is just clearly out of its league and is not, competent to do that, right? So you do have issues, and I think the answers to that is not saying, well, we're going to have a central entity which manages permissions for everyone, right? That's not the answer. That is essentially the model that we don't want to have. The model we would rather have is a model which says, look, everyone can create an arc, everyone can get together and start curating bits and pieces of the scientific record, but we will issue a signifier, a marker of quality on certain types of arcs that are endorsed by certain research organizations, right? And there you can have a wealth of these research organizations. Can be DeSci Foundation, can be others, can be the Ethereum Foundation. Essentially, these are markers of endorsement, and you can imagine now that arcs, in general, arcs that have yet to be endorsed would work and operate to meet the endorsement criteria that would be set by a diverse set of research organization, which might have very different criteria for these endorsements. And we would essentially represent these endorsements as non-transferable tokens on the multi-sig of the arcs, right? And those non-transferable token, or SBTs, would then be surfaced in the front end so that anyone that actually interacts with the system can see the types of endorsement that this entity has received. So that's the part, about people wanting to start their own arcs. I think this should be completely open and with a system to track, endorsements and reputation. And on the other side, you can think, well, we might want to have people expressing their preferences, their values into the system, who are not necessarily financial whales, capable of pouring millions of dollars into funding scientific projects, right? And I think that's absolutely fair. And for me, that's something I'm personally very passionate about. And this is why we've been thinking so hard about this concept of open verifiability. The idea that any research object posted in this decentralized repository, anyone can add a validation grant and specify the type of services, the type of validation that it wants to see carried out, as well as a particular autonomous research community to carry out that grant. And now that means that anyone can have a causal impact on the tree of knowledge. And now you can imagine someone who might, occasionally donate to charity, occasionally, engage in or have an intrinsic interest into certain types of research, essentially put up these micro grants that would directly affect the robustness of the scientific record. So, hope this helps shed some light on your question.
Yeah, and that question is actually related to what I wanted to ask. So thank you. The I think to rephrase it as a danger. Like one of the dangers for DeSci is that we lose focus on kind of the root principles of crypto, which is this permissionless environment where people can join and leave at will, frictionlessly. And all of this is ensured by the layer one blockchain level, which is the ultimate decision, regardless of whether you're a DAO or not. That's where the decisions are getting made. Whoever runs that consensus software is actually the decision maker of the entire system, everything built on top of it. So we might, as we build these layer 2s and 3s, lose sight of who's actually running Ethereum, who are the staking nodes, who are X, Y, and Z, right? So the yeah, I guess that's just it. Rephrasing that, there's no question there. But to rephrase it as a danger, we might lose sight of the root principles of blockchain.
Yeah, I mean the consensus essentially, enforces essentially enforces the current states, but the decisions are still made by human in these DAOs, right? It's just the tallying process, and whether or not this follows, so-called tight coupling or loose coupling. Meaning tight coupling that a on-chain vote has a direct action. Let's say, for example, allowing upgradability of a smart contract or pausing the operations, versus soft governance in which it's an indicative vote and then you have another entity which implements it in the background, right? So I think there's many approaches out there. From my point of view, I think we need to really keep sight of the value we want to add to scientists and scientific communities. And the value prop of decentralization is not something that resonates with, let's say, typical mainstream scientist. However, the value prop of being able to recapture the value that's created by curating knowledge, producing peer reviews, verifying reproducibility, all of that, this is something that speaks universally to scientists right now, which are absolutely fed up of the current journal system. So if anything, this is really what we should focus on. And I would also add that the need for decentralization, meaning the need to have on-chain enforcement of a state, is something which is profoundly depends on the scale and the trust within the communities, right? So when it has to do with financial applications, when you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars or even tens of millions of dollars, yes, you definitely want to have these types of safeguards in place. However, imagine you're now a small community of about 50 people. You all know each other. You all go to the same congresses every year. You do research on, some subfield of physics. And you're interested in setting up an autonomous research community. Well, you can imagine that many of the actions that happen on this arc do not need to be recorded on chain, right? Like even the vast majority of them, the actions that need to have an on-chain touch points are actually rare and far between. And thank God, because this simplifies the UX tremendously. So you can imagine that in these high trust communities, you can have a few chairs who are very senior people and trusted leaders who essentially are the ones responsible for controlling the multi-sig of the DAO. And they can have essentially executive power in selecting which nodes are featured, which research bounties are collected, and all of this. And they can take an input to do this, whether or not they should collect a specific bounty, directly from their communities without the need for any type of tight coupling between, some sort of formal voting process within the small communities and the actions executed by the DAO. So, yeah, so I think, the needs for decentralization is something which is scale dependent. It's not as needed in communities with high levels of trust compared to low levels of trust. It's all a matter of scale.
Cool. I'm curious about your point on the UX as a pitfall.
Yeah, sure. I
I'm
mean,
counting to steal it.
yes, as we implement, our systems, there's pitfalls around wallets that are substantial. security pitfalls. In particular, it's very easy for a naive person to just get wrecked by going on the wrong web page or clicking a bad link on Discord, right? So it feels a little bit, if I had to give a metaphor, like Windows 95, right? In the sense that, you'd click on a web page and your whole computer would become infected by a plethora of viruses and bad things would happen to you, except it's worse because people can actually lose their whole life savings. So this is a genuine, extremely difficult point to navigate. There's also a case to be made that even these non-transferable tokens, these NSBTs, actually should, be reissuable, and they need to be essentially having an intermediary, for example, a DAO multisig, being able to emit and revoke them, such that when people inevitably lose their wallets for whatever reason, because they've been hacked, because they lost their private key, because XYZ down the road, they can then reboot their on-chain reputation, all right? And the question is really, what will come first? Are we going to need to implement these issuance revocation systems, or are we going to have people working on a new generation of Web3 wallets which are enabled for community recovery? Now, this is an incredibly difficult problem. It's known in the field as the kind of web of trust problem, and I think there's a really couple of fascinating articles on that. And so these problems together do definitely add to the UX challenge. And I think it's something that we're going to need, especially when you're working with Web3, with communities that are not familiar with Web3. We might just need to abstract away as much of this as possible and let even perhaps gateways and DAOs be responsible for guarding the reputations and the achievements of their community members, right? So there is a case to be made that this is actually the safer route because of the poverty of the UX and Web3 right now.
Yeah, I think that's particularly relevant for scientists too. Like you're saying, they're not really Web3 native. They shouldn't need to spend time to learn all these different platforms. They should just be able to sort of plug in and start working with this new technology.
Yeah, and I think that's why, if you have a trusted community of, let's say, 50 to 100 scientists operating an ARC, it could be that the entire Web3 part of it is abstracted at the ARC level, right? Meaning at the level of the multisig, which controls ultimately the minting and the distribution of fellowships and all of that, right? So there's a real problem with the lack of efficient community recovery wallets right now, and the problems around hacking and poor UX. Nonetheless, I do think a lot of those can be overcome. So that's something, which, I'm happy to go more into the details of that, but I think there are ways to overcome them. It's just that they're very intensive on the development end of things, and we, prefer focusing on other parts than solving for identity and solving for wallet UX.
Yeah, I think all the stuff you're talking about too, like the everyone can still lose their keys, the web of trust concepts, all this ties into another pitfall, which is thinking that we're going to solve, like DeSci is going to solve all the problems tomorrow or this year or within the next 5 years, thinking that this is a sprint instead of a marathon when it comes to this sort of technology. I think it's important that we don't lose sight of how many projects are going to fail and how many new projects are going to come up that are going to succeed in 5 years instead of right now, right? This is all very new.
Yeah, definitely. And it could very well be that many DeSci projects, they actually, they discover that there's one or two pain points that are insurmountable, and then end up focusing on these pain points and making essentially products and solutions that are actually unrelated to their initial forays, right? So this is what happened to Gnosis with their prediction market. They ended up making the Gnosis multisig. So there's there's a lot of these cases where people come in with ambitious projects that are great applications of Web3 technology, but then along the road, they discover that there's a primitive missing for it. And then they focus their energy on that primitive, and this becomes, the essentially the product that they've been developing.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, John. I've heard quite a few people kind of mention the fact that, oh, well, we have to onboard the entire scientific community within the next 12 months. And generally, the justification for doing so is lackluster, to say the best. I was talking to someone from Google's Web3 development team, I think a week or two ago, and their pitch to me as to why I should care about Google and Web3 was, oh, we can make this move so much faster. We can have everyone on board within the next 5 years if you just give 30% control of the entire ecosystem to Google. And I'm like, hold on, man, take a step back here. Let's think through this one. That is a very relevant problem that I had not considered. Thank you.
That actually highlights another pitfall. VC and major corporations. It goes back to a comment I made about who actually owns the layer one. Like if Ethereum goes proof of stake, who's actually has the coin to stake in that? So if DeSci is a bunch of projects trying to build new technology, who actually owns the stake and control of that technology at the end of the day? Is it going to be Google? Is it going to be Microsoft? Are we again falling in? This brings up what Ellie was talking about before. Are we falling into the same system that we're trying to get away from in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how deep you go down the chain of ownership, I mean, then it's like, well, at the end of the day, Amazon has root permission to your cloud service provider, right? So is it Amazon? And who then controls that? There's undoubtedly an incredibly long chain of trusted intermediaries and relationships and service providers that power the web today. And that's not going to go away, right? So if anything, the trend has been towards a tremendous level of consolidation and market dominance from big players in these winner takes all market. And I think that's far now. That's like far outside of the scope of the issues we need to solve. But just to make a parallel, this has also been happening in scientific digital publishing, right? So like the share of the big players have been increasing over the years because they are the ones capable of generating a surplus and reinvesting in technology solutions and platforms and things that essentially give benefit from the huge scale at which they operate to then be able to extract even more revenue from their customers. One of the case in point, Elsevier is not a scientific publishing company anymore. It's a information company. It's a data company. So they want to essentially own the workflow around science and sell data to funders, to different parties, to different entities that might be interested in purchasing this type of data for various reasons, being for tracking the efficacy of their grants. There's many different use cases of monetizing data that happen at an extremely large scale, just like what's currently going on with Elsevier. So yes, so there's an approach for the consolidation of these giant behemoths. And again, I think the best protection we have against this is to enshrine a vision for governance that enfranchises stakeholders beyond shareholders, right? So that means you would want to have the governance of the system when it comes to the whole scientific funding side and scientific certification and the best practices all around this. You want to essentially make sure that people like meta scientists, like scientists, have a seat at the table. And I think that's essential so that we will have much more investment into creating more reproducible science, in incentivizing scientists in the right way to make their artifacts available. If we have that type of enfranchisement at the table, right? Because the alternative of this is saying, well, me as a scientific publisher, I have zero business model for anything else beyond selling PDFs, because that's what pays the bills at the end of the day. The people that buy my PDFs are, library and research institutions, and they pay. They do not buy, code repositories. They do not buy data. They do not buy any types of other research artifacts beyond that peer-reviewed PDF. So I think it's very important to consider how these types of incentives are flow down directly from the governance structures of these corporations.
I love it. And sort of tied to governance is the pitfall of making clicks. So exclusive NFT communities, exclusive NTT communities, stuff like that. Again, back to the base question that Ellie has brought up. It might just rebuild the system that we currently live in with the exact same biases.
Well, even if it had the exact same biases and reproducibility would go up by 20%, it would still be a massive victory, right?
Fair.
So, it's not like I don't think we should have the ambition, like, let's say, enter a stage of like analysis paralysis, or worse, like what if it gets, what if it's what if it's not perfect, right? What if what we're doing isn't perfect? I mean, the answer to this is like, obviously it'll never be. I think we need to iterate fast. We need to consider, focus our intellectual firepower on specific problems which are have been identified as high points of leverage, and and essentially put in like safeguards in place so that things, if the system becomes very successful, that it doesn't essentially degenerate into a suboptimal equilibrium as best as we can. But we should not expect going into this, coming up with like a solution that is, perfect in all regard. We need to be humble. We need to understand that we will make mistake, that we will fail in various levels, and we need to be able to take feedback. And we should understand that we need to focus on high leverage points and try to maximize the value we bring to societies on these identified high leverage points.
Yeah, I think actually the solution is already here, like that grand solution you're describing, and it's the nature of the technology we're working with, how it's grounded in uh, tokenomics, despite the dangers that come with that, and it's also grounded in permissionless and open source software. So if we get a project that solves a couple issues, but then ends up regressing because of the way the solutions were implemented, we can iterate on it, and we can change it and just fork it really quickly and try again in a different way. And as long as there's never someone or some intermediary that can just stop that process, then the theory, I think, is we can iterate until it actually is what a lot of us would view as quote unquote perfect, even though yes, it will never actually be perfect.
Absolutely, and I think that's really one of the powers of open source code, right? And it's the idea that you can fork it, and that is, let's say, high coordination costs with tremendous consequences, and it's essentially the ultimate escape exit mechanism. And yeah, I'm all for it. I think it's perhaps one of the coolest meta governance tools that has been identified in Web3, is the ability for systems to fork. And of course, there's a limitation because you can't fork the fund associated with a protocol, and you can't fork, well, necessarily its community, but you can definitely use that as a credible threat or conflict resolution system when all other, softer governance approach fail.
Chris, I would actually be very curious to hear your take on some of the high leverage points you were mentioning earlier. If you had to pick the top 3 high leverage points that DeSci should be focusing on, what would they be?
For me, it's so one of them is returning value to scientists involved in the curation of the scientific record. I think that would be a tremendously a good thing to do if we could, build infrastructure that is robust and easy enough to do, that creates a demand for these types of service, and all of a sudden, be able to dispense, have these communities dispense fellowship for postdocs who are suffering with wages that are postdocs and PhD students that can be below the poverty line, and give them an income supplement. I think that is a tremendously high leverage point. Another tremendously high leverage point, I believe, is DeSci positioning itself as the place where scientists publish, where scientists that care about reproducibility publish reproducible research. Meaning they publish their code, they publish data, they might have a reproducible container associated with their manuscript, and they try to create an ease of reproducibility for their colleagues, for other to build on their work. So I think these 2 points are incredibly high leverage, because first of all, they add to the welfare of scientists, and second, it adds to the welfare of science and the quality of knowledge.
Thank you. Those are both excellent points.
Yeah, maybe I can just chime in here. So I think like the third one is obviously open access, right? So this is so at the moment the publication industry is of course building primarily on a business model that is restricting open access or makes scientists pay for it. And if you can come up with a way that scientific knowledge can be shared broadly to the public without any access barriers, and have a business model associated with it that allows the system to be sustainable in the long run, that's another really, really large leverage point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to be so immersed into the open access problem that I don't even mention it anymore.
I know.
Like, thinking at like what comes after, but yes, I definitely agree. That's a tremendous issue, and especially the alternative business model that returns values to. I think that's absolutely essential.
If I could jump in with a question, it's going back a little bit before the leverage points conversation. And it's more of an implementation question in terms of DeSci nodes. But one criticism I've heard of DeSci nodes is that it uses these more slightly powerful, or not DeSci nodes, but the arcs in general. Is that it uses these more potentially more powerful quote unquote communities, such as DeSci labs or such as Ethereum or such of these things, to verify the arcs. And the limitation that people say is like, okay, well, this creates a bias. People are going to move towards these larger communications instead of focusing on the research that needs to be done for potentially stakeholders, like someone who has diabetes or someone at that lower level. So I was wondering if, I just misunderstood it, and there is a verifiability that comes from a large population being like, hey, I want this research to be done. Or if this, or if you see some way around the potential biasing effects of having verification done by these larger groups.
So verification isn't done per se by these larger groups. Essentially, anyone can open an ARC, and anyone can start forking nodes and essentially doing curation of research and publishing their own nodes. So that is permissionless. The question then, of course, is, well, if it's a matter of like, how do we select which research question should be funded, or how should we select what are essentially the proxies that, or endorsements, and how are endorsements essentially distributed, right, from a top-down or a bottom-up fashion, right? So I think these are two very independent questions. Anyone who essentially is fascinated by questions of like developing better insulin models, better cheaper insulin manufacturing drugs, The idea is that you can like set up a prize, you can set up a bounty or a grant program. Now that is absolutely doable, and I think it's not a matter of essentially restricting permissions to do that, but it's a matter of having the financial capabilities to put up these grants, right? So that's a different type of matter. And when it comes to curation, the system is permissionless. Now there will be some endorsements and markers of essentially, with DeSci Foundation will be distributing some startup funds. We'll hopefully have some sort of systems that will allow we will have these type of systems that allow a non-transferable token that will be displayed onto these art pages. But it's not limited to this. So anyone can essentially, go on the SPT Foundry contract, and start emitting their own markers of endorsement for some of these organizations. So now you can imagine a patient group, let's say a patient group that focuses interest on a particular type of rare disease, a rare condition that is very often ignored by both the research ecosystem, but also by pharmaceutical industry. Well, you could imagine that they could issue, a token of recognition to certain types of art who have been, engaging in verifying or producing that type of research, right? So it's not a matter of essentially there's an entity that gates, who is allowed to do what on the system. It's more a matter of like anyone can do things, but there are markers that track affiliation, attestation, memberships, and endorsements. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, cool. That gets to it a bit, just in terms of like finding ways to diversify the ways of verifying.
I think the DSOC paper, Finding the Soul of Web3, is really interesting in that regard. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend having a look at it. I think it offers some very interesting solutions on how to produce plural network goods and how we can have kind of a fractal emergence of scales of coordination that are essentially enacted by mechanisms which distribute these non-transferable tokens. So highly recommend it if you want to have a really good overview of what's the state of the art thinking in that regard.
Yes.
So currently we are at 12:55. I think we have time for one more question before we close out, or one more potential pitfall. Does anyone have one that they want to throw out? Chris, do you have anything else that you want to add on to?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately, maybe we can have some concluding remarks. Happy to take a question, so anyone feel free to interrupt me. But yeah,
I'm gonna do that. I think
great.
I have I have like one other pitfall that I see is the whole DeSci movement right now, talking so much about using blockchain, using Web3 and decentralization, for their project, that if one of the project gets adopted widely and then it fails, then the entire ecosystem of Web3 and decentralized science is kind of tainted, because then people are like, oh, no, this space, it doesn't work because this one big project failed. And because we're talking so much about the technology that we're using and not, as you already mentioned, the products that we're building and the solutions that we're offering, that like the underlying technology gets basically stained if one project fails, and then all projects suffer as a result.
I completely agree with you, Carla, and I've been actually quite worried about this. In general, it's absolutely the case that there's contagion effects in these industries. So when one failed, it's very easy for all of the rest to be lumped into the same bucket. Whether it's a scam, whether it's like a problem related to unauthorized offerings of securities. There's a lot of risk, and I think there's also a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. I do hope that we will have value propositions that will be sufficiently uncorrelated, or essentially that there will be some projects in the space that achieve kind of an escape velocity away from some of the more pressing problems. But let's see, all of this is music for the future. I can only hope that people take a responsible path going forward. That's why I'm always very loud to call out these like obvious as scams popping up in on different platforms. But I think it's definitely a real problem, and especially that it can, if it happens before the space has demonstrated a value prop to scientists and to science, then we're in for some very tough times, essentially.
Are there any ideas on how to avoid that pitfall? For example, maybe instead of focusing all of DeSci's effort on implementing scientific tools on blockchains and Web3 tech, using our communities and networking to reinforce legacy communities and developments around sort of similar ideals. So the open science movement without Web3, essentially.
I think that's absolutely essential. And I think it's also important for the DeSci community not to be, to essentially, respect the amazing work that people in the open science communities have done, and to essentially work with them and find angles of complementarity within the legacy scientific publishing ecosystem. So I think all of this is absolutely essential.
Oh man, and that just brings up another pitfall. We got 1 minute.
Yeah.
Completely excluding the legacy system. There's a lot we can change and improve on it, but I don't think we want to push them out.
We cannot exclude the legacy system. We have to essentially reinforce and improve on the state of things. I think it's essential to work alongside and not against. And I mean, there's obvious reasons for that, but I think DeSci should be a parallel system, not a dichotomous choice. It shouldn't be DeSci or TradSci. It should be, hey, you want to publish your research, in whatever journal is relevant for your career, that will get you grants. Well, yes, of course, do it. But on top of it, if you want to be able to publish, create a research object, publish your code, get verified attributes, get badges showing that you follow like the ideals of open science, and that you've done a great job at like going above the call of duty of these journals. Well, then create a DeSci node, create a DeSci research paper, right? And these two objects will be they'll be interlinked with each other, and that means you'll have discoverability on both sides. And that's why it's important, to create that linking, to have discoverability on both sides. We need to be able to work with legacy institutions and the scientific publishers, and also the wonderful organizations that have been spearheading this whole open science movement, just like, for example, the Center for Open Science.
Man, thank you for your thoughts, Chris and Philip.
Thank you for excellent questions.
And as always, this call is going to be recorded and put on YouTube. So for anyone who wants to see it there, feel free to go take a look. And with that, I think we're pretty much done for today. I know there's more discussion that can come, but thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thanks. See ya. Get out of here, Craig.